find her standing by the way.
Welcome to the fourth episode of the Meon podcast dedicated to the revival of Irish intellectual life. For our fourth episode, we are proud to present a discussion that took place with the editor of Aureus Press. Aureus Press was founded in 2017 by its editor, Brendan Hurd, perhaps best known for publishing The Decline and Fall of Western Art. Aegeon Science Fiction Illustrated signified a new direction for Aureus Press, with each issue containing a compilation of illustrated science fiction stories by a number of writers, including Brendan himself. Our discussion will centre on the intersection between universalism and Irish republicanism, his experiences on both sides of the Atlantic as an Irish Canadian, and the dark underbelly of the 60s counterculture. In the interests of continuity, Brendan's introduction to the podcast has been included at the beginning of this podcast.
Today I am interviewing Mark from Meon. How do you pronounce it?
Meon, I think.
Meon.
I didn't set up the
Okay.
project, so...
You didn't? Oh, I didn't know that. Maybe we should
No.
discuss that right off the bat. Okay, so Meon Journal, which is described as dedicated to revival of Irish intellectual life. Is that,
Yep.
is
That's
that fair to say?
That's the line I go with. Yep.
Right. And we had met before, but we met really more formally. Was it last weekend? That was last week. Yes.
Yep. We had an event
Last week
titled Our Gallant Allies, Continental and American Perspectives on Populism. I think that was the title. That might be slightly wrong. My memory is atrocious, but look, it is what it is.
Yeah, and it was great. It was one of the best. It was the best of those such things that I've been to so far.
Thank you.
That they put on. Yeah, it was very well done, and excellent speakers, and it was great. So of course we had a few drinks after, and we were like, "Oh, we should do a stream." You had been following my stream, and you were really you were really excited by the Shrek interview, so you wanted to talk about that at some point. But
yeah, we'll get onto that later.
We'll get onto that later. The point of this is, for me, so give you a chance anyways to talk about this project and how you got involved, who started it, and what you're up to a little bit. We may as well talk about that.
Yeah, so Meon was founded from memory in 2021. It's really a child of lockdown. If you look back at some of the early articles, this is also reflected in the mission statement, which was written by its founders. You'll see a preoccupation with what they call scientism, the cult of science. For those of us who were around back then, this was quite the mania, and no kind of distance sort of tempers anxieties and anger. It was a time in which there genuinely was righteous anger, and that was expressed creatively in this publication. Unfortunately, Meon was kind of somewhat dormant. Well, not dormant, but it was intermittent. It never really, it never published works on a regular timeline, and that occurred for a variety of reasons. And that really was the story with the publication, that it would publish these very good articles, but rather intermittently, occasionally.
Publish them in different journals, or just on its own website, or
on its own website.
Right.
Yeah, so that was the kind of story until around February of last year.
Can I ask, were you involved from the start, or would you not?
No, but I knew the people, and I think I was there for one of the early discussions. I wrote an article for them in 2022.
Okay.
I won't mention the exact article, but it was well received, and I always.
Why would you then?
Okay,
right. You don't want to say it.
Meon had some. Well, it's under a different name, I suppose. I thought Meon had legs, so to speak, and it just kind of needed something to get off the ground. So I think in February of last year, I penned an article relating to a guy by the name of John Quinn. He's an American. He's dead now. He was an American art critic, collector. He was really the guy that assisted and did the nitty gritty, boring work that allowed modernism to seep into the American scene. He's the reason why James Joyce. Now, you could argue, I suppose, that James Joyce's Ulysses would have broken into the American market eventually, but he was instrumental in sort of repealing prohibitions on modernist artwork, or I think artwork generally from Europe, which allowed that book to sort of permeate into America. Now, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing depends on your evaluation of Joyce. But there was actually a guy at the event last week. I won't mention him by name, but he takes a rather, from a nationalist perspective, a rather positive view of Joyce, which is rather.
I'm guessing it's the fellow, without saying any names, that we was sitting with you and him talking for a little while. Is that possibly?
Yeah, that's
I knew
it.
it.
That's it.
I knew it.
Rather interesting character, but
oh, you're great.
Yeah, so I wrote this last year, and the editor, there had been an editor between the initial editors and myself in that intervening interval. So I think he'd kind of moved on to other things. The publication was dormant, so I thought I'd try my hand at it, and it seems to.
And are we not allowed to say the names of the original? Is that?
No. I'll skip that.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so it seemed to it seems to have worked. We've gone from, now Meon isn't a huge platform by any means, but I think we've grown about tenfold since around February of last year.
Very good.
Gone from purely a website in which we post articles to having a further two facets. The first of which is a podcast. I recorded a podcast last month with Peter Ryan, who's an Irish American economist, which there's 3 parts of that on our YouTube channel. And then we had the event last week, and a further facet, which I want to delve into, and I'm kind of proud to announce, I suppose, on this podcast, is book publishing. I know that's something you're very interested in as well, and I might want to chat to you behind the scenes about too. But the first book that we have in mind is a consolidated series of critiques written between the years 1898 to 1904, courtesy of a rather mendacious yet brilliant individual by the name of Frank Hugh O'Donnell, who is an Irish parliamentarian in the British Parliament for the Irish Parliamentary Party. He claimed to be the progenitor of Parnell's obstructionism and derided Parnell as a communist, which is not something he slandered as normally. He definitely spoiled and ruined a Fenian plot to transport guns to the Transvaal. Yet was a member of the IRB. He's kind of a web of contradictions. Yeats, in his recollections, called him a half sewer rat, half genius, and I think really that fits his character well. So that should be out in the coming months, and I'm looking forward to releasing that. So that's about it about sort of Meon.
And that's great. It's great to have those kind of characters that have the because everyone has that duality within them, but the ones that actually play up both sides in a confusingly extreme way are the best kind of characters. Obviously, in a lot of ways. Yeah. I don't know some of that stuff about him.
One more thing on O'Donnell. He has this great work called The Message of the Masters. Now, it's around 45 pages long, 2/3 of which is an explication of each of the stanzas. Now, these stanzas aren't complicated. They're rather standard for kind of 19th century nationalistic verse.
Yeah.
But what's important about them and why they're worth reading is just the extent to which he trashes almost every single individual mentioned in these stanzas. I should probably mention that the whole poetic work is written from the perspective of the four masters. And it's their sort of judgment of various figures in Irish history, from the aforesaid Parnell, who they decry as a communist agitator, to Wolfe Tone, a French sort of an Anglo interloper spreading French ideas, to Daniel O'Connell, who ruined the Irish language.
Wolfe Tone.
He despised Wolfe Tone because he's in that Moran tradition, and him, D.P.
He's in that what tradition? Sorry, the what tradition?
The tradition of D.P. Moran. Moran was
I don't know.
An Irish journalist from the early 20th century.
Right.
Late 19th century, early 20th century. He was the founder and editor of a publication called The Leader, which, along with the United Irishman, was one of the main nationalist publications. Like Sinn Féin, Griffith's project, it counselled the Irish to adopt self-reliance as opposed to political agitation. There's a degree of political agitation for Sinn Féin, I suppose, but Moran's position was that Irish republicanism contained, as a seed, as an incipient kind of flaw within it, a kind of universalism, and that this goes to figures like Tone,
which it still suffers from this to this day, obviously, in the incarnation of Sinn Féin.
Whereas some will say that this is subversion later on, someone like Moran would say that this was a fault from the start with the project. I don't know if I fully agree. I don't know where to.
I would agree with that. I would agree with this. I don't even know who this guy is, and I'm agreeing with him because I think at the conference when I got really drunk, I started ranting about republicanism is not the greatest, and everyone should have monarchy, and that you should bring back the Irish High Kings and not be shy about monarchy just because the King of England was the enemy.
Well, republicanism for the sort of mass of people involved in these movements from 1798 onwards was never really a question of governmental form. It was always an
No, but
expression
there
of
was a
Irish
kind of
independence.
it was definitely a socialist or a kind of a bit of an egalitarian kind of. Everyone had that since post Marx. There was and socialism. I'm not even opposed to socialism or anything like that, but I do think there's something. I would agree with him. There's a strain of universalism in it
I
from
think
the
you're gonna
start.
have to. I think you have to differentiate socialism from republicanism, right? So, and I don't mean Irish republicanism. I mean the ideology of republicanism.
Well, I believe
Which
in
I'm
I believe in
referencing
full on.
before.
I believe in full on pharaonic, authoritarian, theocratic monarchy.
Right. But
I think that's
what
so.
I
I'm
would say is
totally
that what happened with 1798 is it was a confluence of two distinct trajectories, right? And these
right.
trajectories, which had different social bases, which have different identities. On the one hand, you had more well-to-do Protestants that were very
Yeah.
literate, some of the most literate people in these two islands, that were in
Yeah.
discourse with revolutionaries in America, revolutionaries in Britain, revolutionaries to an extent on the continent. These were the people that were the standard bearers, like Wolfe Tone. I know he wasn't a Presbyterian.
And
A lot of his
Pierce was
guys were.
Protestant, wasn't he? Was Pierce
No,
Protestant?
Pierce was
Or no?
Catholic. His
Oh
dad was
shit!
like
Right.
an
Okay.
English freethinker. But I mean, just
Okay.
to center in on 1798,
Yeah.
what you have with these guys is with respect to Wolfe Tone et al. You have this Republican ideology, but that's joined at the hip with a dispossessed kind of Catholic, landless element slash peasant element, which is not universalist, which is very sort of ethnocentric, and you see that manifested in particular locales in 1798, like in Wexford, under Father Murphy. These guys didn't even
Right.
know anything about universalism. They barely knew anything about the United Irishmen. Yet they ended up kind of part of this
Right.
thing because logistics back then was a far more difficult thing than it is today.
Right.
It was more of a stumbling block. So I wouldn't completely dismiss these movements. And I think republicanism, you see a huge shift. There's a very good, I think, I can't remember which sort of post or which account posted this, but if you compare the number of Protestants involved in 1798 to 1916, there's a dramatic drop, despite the fact that there was a sort of universalism arguably tethered to 1916 via
Yeah.
Connolly. Not that I'm dismissing Connolly. So I wouldn't
Yeah.
dismiss the project altogether. I think Moran has a certain validity to his argument in that what republicanism always tried to do in Ireland was place the Gael and the non-Gael Gaelic later comers, or late coming sort of groups such as the Anglo-Irish on equal footing. It said
Mm-hmm.
that these groups were both equally integral to the Irish nation. And what Moran said is,
Mm-hmm.
no, the root of the Irish nation is the Gael, not this kind of concoction. And in that, I think
I
he's
definitely agree
valid.
with this Moran guy. I definitely agree with this Moran guy, even though I myself half mixed race, half Anglo. But the essential root would be, it has to be. I think he's
Yeah.
right.
And I think
But
one of them
the whole
admitted.
roundabout thing. Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to
Go on.
say John Mitchell, and this is something which I don't think a lot of people know about. I was reading a biography of him. He was one of the main Republicans of the foremost Republicans of the 19th century, and he was a Protestant by background, a Presbyterian. But his daughter, John Mitchell, is a fascinating guy. But when he was in America, I think his daughter had left to Paris to become a nun. This would have been completely sort of offensive to kind of Mitchell's father if he was still alive, and the kind of sensibility from which he came. And Mitchell reflected on his decision, and he was a very interesting guy. Very intolerant in some ways, very tolerant in other ways, but he was completely permissive toward this decision. And he said, I think part of it was because she died soon after, and he was reflecting here, and I'm quoting him now. I think part of it was that she always realized that there was something more integral to Irishness about Catholicism than Protestantism. And I think that's a slight admission on his part that the universalism that was propagated by certain Republicans back then, and a lot of them today, on the Republican left, is a bit of a lie.
What?
It
has Protestant roots. You mean it has a Protestant exclusionary roots? Is that reason? What I mean?
Well, there's an extent to that with Wolfe Tone, but what I mean is that Mitchell was essentially admitting that there's something more real about the Irish Catholic bloc as a people, right? Whatever you think about Catholicism as a religion, but that kind of bloc, that has more of a relation to Irishness than Protestant kind of interlopers whose parentage goes back to the 17th century or whatever, and later
Yeah, I would
plantations.
agree. I would agree. I would agree.
And that's just an admission a lot of people don't actually know about. So I just thought I'd mention.
So Moran just disliked Wolfe Tone for being Protestant, essentially, is it? Or
I wouldn't say that. I would say that
well,
I would say that he viewed something kind of subversive about the Republican project, and that it was
right,
subversive of what the Irish nation was. For him, what mattered more than the political forum was that the subsistence of the nation itself,
right.
which he thought
You want
was under threat by Anglicization then, and probably Americanization today if he had lived.
right, right. I must drop this anecdotal story on you because I think I was telling you who was I telling you? At the event when I was telling somebody about how I worked at this record label, but I was also involved with the Wolfe Tones, and this is when I first moved here. And I didn't not only was I not I wasn't like I was never really a liberal anyways, but I wasn't say red pilled as they say, and I didn't know really much about Irish nationalism, and I didn't know much about the Wolfe Tones either. But I happened to find myself involved with them, and I made, as a graphic designer, 2 or 3 of their compilation albums. One of them is actually really good. I did a good job. I'm quite proud of it.
Fair play.
I can't remember which one it is. So there's these Wolfe Tones albums out there by total coincidence that I was involved in. My name's on them and stuff. And the wife used to laugh her ass off. She'd look at my phone because I didn't even know who he was. I didn't know much about them. And she'd look at my phone, and I had like Brian Warfield as a contact on my phone, and she would just laugh her ass off. That was the funniest thing.
Yeah.
But all that is that's all that is completely pre me learning anything about proper Irish nationalism or any of it.
I've just looked up the cover. I've just looked up the covers here, and I'm just curious which ones you did.
It'd be ones for Liffey Records. So there's 2 of them for sure. There's a shitty gold one, a gold something or other with a shitty gold shamrock on it. That's just I more or less had to do what I was told. That was the most recent one, and there's a really good one. It's hard to find. They're not easy to find because it's not, but because there's just like assembling their greatest hits and
Oh right, yeah, I got you.
Redoing.
Oh, I think I see that one. I think I can see the 50th anniversary concert one.
Is it with a shitty like gold shamrock? Golden?
Yeah.
Okay. The other one is cool if you can find it. It's I don't remember. It's before that, and I took the bore off the what's the big chalice that's in the National Gallery? The that they found in the the one.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a big thing like that, and so I took some of that imagery, and I basically took bits off of that, and I made like a gold Wolfe Tones logo over top the tricolor. It's ages ago now. I'd have to find it, but actually, that's the one I'm proud of. That is actually really cool. But it's even harder to find than the shitty Shamrock one, which was the last one. That was really Warfield himself was actually kind of a jerk. I shouldn't say this.
Really,
I shouldn't talk.
I can talk about people if you want, but.
No, I don't care. It doesn't matter. He'll never see this. He doesn't give a shit. He lives in Florida. That's the thing. He lives in Florida. Wolfe Tone in his story, but what's your opinion of Wolfe Tone?
Well, I think like Irish society had gotten this is less an opinion on Wolfe Tone and more what he represented. The Irish social order collapsed, right? Ireland was very out of sync with the rest of Western Europe. You compare it even to a country like England, which centralized by the time of 1000 AD. Was that around when Alfred was knocking about? And the Normans built atop that kind of structure. Gaelic society, never had that centralization. The High Kingship was not a power that could project influence across the island. Now, like kind of pre-modern monarchies were always kind of weak to an extent, but it was especially weak. And so there's an advantage to that, and that advantage is that if you're invaded, and this is evinced by the struggles the Normans had in conquering the island, if you need to navigate your way through a patchwork of small kind of little statelets, it's very difficult because you form an alliance with one, but that doesn't bind his neighbor, a mile down the road. and as soon as you finally get through to his neighbor, well, the other guy stabbed you in the back. So it's a very difficult society to break through. And what happens in the 17th century is the collapse of the Gaelic social order early on, and the Normans kind of later in that century. And you kind of have the reduction of the Catholic Irish population, which itself had only really become a thing. Not that Irish people weren't Catholic, but that Norman Gaelic reconciliation only really became a thing in the 17th century. I think up to that point, you even had Geoffrey Keating, the famed Norman scholar. He was not permitted to use, I think, one of the O'Neill's archives because he was a Norman. So that mattered that late.
Really?
That's centuries and centuries after the Norman invasion of Ireland. So you reach this point in the 18th century that you have a people whose whole social orders collapsed. And there's a certain attraction to republicanism in that, being a tabula rasa ideology, it fits very well with the tabula rasa environment in which people's kind of traditions, people's prism by which they view the world, people's structures, natural loyalties, hierarchies, etc. Are all falling away. So you kind of have to construct something new. And so that critique, which an Edmund Burke would have proffered against the French Revolution, the thing that made us a tabula rasa was not Wolfe Tone. What made us a tabula rasa was Britain. So yeah, that's kind of my perspective on not so much Wolfe Tone, but what he represented.
You're even more of a tabula rasa now than you ever were.
In a sense, I suppose, yeah.
In a certain sense, or you will be.
The little black flies, always a black fly, no matter where you go. I'll die with the black fly picking my bones in North Ontario, in North Ontario. Well, the man black.
So if I could just flip it back on you. You're obviously not originally from Ireland. You're from. Do you mind if I say where you're from?
No, it doesn't matter at all. Yeah.
You're from Canada originally, and
British Columbia.
British Columbia. So, like, what are your observations?
Actually, I lived in Ireland. Would you believe till I was 7? I did live here.
I remember you saying that.
Yeah. Then we moved over there, so I had a little Irish accent. I had to lose it over time when I went there.
Yeah.
And people say to this day I talk I have a funny way of speaking, and maybe it's something to do with that. I'm not sure. But
so, like, when did you move over here? What age were you?
I moved back when I was 32, and that was 32. Yes, 32. Yeah, and then I only came here on I was doing a working holiday. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say you kind of experienced like peak, and by peak I don't mean at its height, but like at its best, like globalization in Canada, a sense where like Canada still kind of had a cool edge. It's kind of like one big Portland, but it's also like now more globalized, except the bad aspects of globalization haven't really hit it as they've hit it in the last few years. Would that be accurate? Was your experience in Canada, or is that completely off?
Jesus, that's a very complex question.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a very small town in the Rockies, and it was a beautiful place, wonderful. I'm dying to go back. To take my kids at least to visit, but it's so expensive to go. But so it was a very much a little bubble environment to itself. It wasn't like dare I say, an entirely white little town. And I mean entirely. I had one friend who was half black, and he was the only fellow in the town, I think. But it was a mix of standard Canadian Western settlers, which would be a mix generally of just like the old flag of Canada. It would be generally a lot of Irish, a lot of Welsh, a lot of Scottish and English. Not many like Germans in that, but a smattering of French. And so that's sort of the original stock of the town. And then in my particular town, there was a massive injection of Russians and Portuguese that were fleeing this and that. God knows. I know the Russians came fleeing the Tsar during before World War I. They're Doukhobors. It's a sect. Tolstoy has a book about them, or a short book about them. Yeah, they're a sort of a strange Christian sect that had certain beliefs, and I know they even they burned down that we had a museum in the town, a small museum, and they burned it down because it had dinosaur bones. So this was against so they're a little bit fundamentalist in their belief.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's this. I grew up with a lot of Russian kids and Portuguese kids. And this
so even decades later, you still had these kind of ethnic kind of minorities, like
but those were Russians, all that was all just like even like say, the most different you'd think would be the Portuguese, but no, actually I have a lot of Portuguese. I would actually probably have more Portuguese friends than I had the Russian ones, if I think back. And maybe
right.
more
So
of
it's
it.
more like people just know that they came from here, but they're all kind of just assimilated into like this kind of
Well,
little Canadian town, or am I?
well, they've been there for a couple of generations, and they
Yeah.
still had Russian accents. I'll tell you that, because
Oh,
this in
really?
particular, because they were really insular with this religion. They still held on to this religion, right? This Doukhobor religion,
Right.
and there's a certain insular nature to the Russians there, but they were, generally. So this. It was very much like Twin Peaks. You ever see Twin Peaks?
Yeah,
It looked
I
and
watched
was like,
Twin Peaks for the first time last year. Yeah, I really loved it.
yeah, it was like that little logging town, basically, right?
Mm.
It's surrounded by trees and all that.
Everyone knows
So,
each other,
but then,
yeah.
yeah, but so I would only notice, and I grew up in like the end of the 80s and the 90s, and it was all just like in the small town. We just have heavy metal parties in the woods and like big bonfires, and that was our night out, let's say, right? But I would notice then when I would go to Vancouver, or we just cross the border into Spokane, Washington, then you would see the globalism a little bit more. You'd see
Mm.
you would be like, oh, there's especially when you went to Vancouver, you would note right away, like there would seemingly be, even back then, more Chinese people than the native stock, as it were.
Oh, really?
Right? Yeah, even, well, or maybe not more, definitely more now, but
Yeah.
certainly, like, you'd be like, "Whoa, this is like entering another country here." Many streets you could walk down and no one would be speaking English or anything like that.
Mm.
So that's where you would get a taste of that, of the world to come, I guess. So in a way, I grew up in a closed and insular. All that whole long convoluted story was my way of answering that. In a way, we were apart from that, and almost in a different country from the good globalism you were trying to pin on Canada, which I don't think, or the good multiculturalism, or the good.
Well, I wasn't saying that. I suppose it was more that I don't know like how I was going to phrase it. Like I think what's revealing about my previous question is that I said one big Portland. So I'm kind of imagining something that's roughly homogenous with good music that kind of has like a bohemian edge to it. Maybe that's completely off. I
Well,
don't know. I
I
wasn't
don't know about
praising
Portland, because
their migration policies, but
well, Vancouver had a lot of hippies, and there was some
yeah,
good scenes there. I remember I did go and live there afterwards, and I had a lot of fun there. Yeah, it was all right.
because I
But
remember
there's also a lot
mentioning
of
like that
fun.
band Godspeed You Black Emperor to you. I really
Right,
to them.
right,
I saw
right,
them
right.
actually when they came to Dublin. Was it late last year. They're really good.
I had no idea they were still around. Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, they're very like I think they're one of these organizations that have their own bespoke approach to like I don't know social media, to how they interact with their like listenership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not standard. They don't operate like I don't know, an Instagram or whatever. It's very
Right,
just like, oh, we're coming here, scramble to get there. We'll sell some of
right.
our merchandise here, but you can't get it online. You can't do this. I suppose it's this like forced attempt to be authentic, and then that calls into question authenticity. But look, I just like the music, so
Yeah.
um,
Well, they're from Toronto, I think. That's the other thing
mm,
about Canada. I mean, despite what I said about Vancouver, um, in a certain sense, this is one thing I noticed when I came here, because even despite living in Ireland until I was 7, and occasionally my mother would bring me back for a couple of weeks in the summer. I was limited my experience in Europe, let's say, and my full understanding of what was going on and how it worked. After being here for a while, was that so? Despite what I was saying about Vancouver being very multicultural and very different, overall, the real Canadian, what you felt was the real older stock Canadians, the normal, how can I say it? The natives, or I can't even say the
yeah,
natives
I
because
got
there's
you,
the
I got
Aboriginal.
you.
The what you must call the original Canadians, let's say,
Yeah,
would be everywhere, and there would be it's very funny. It's not, and the wife noticed this too when we drove some distance across it. It's like there's even the landscape changes extremely gradually. You go from BC into Alberta, you leave the Rockies, the enormous mountains, trees everywhere, and then it slowly, slowly, over days of travel, turns into a grassland, and that grassland goes on for days and days and days. If you ever drive right across the country, there's only an extremely gradual change in scenery, and even then, it's all kind of similar in a certain way. And in terms of people you meet, the average Canadian, there's really only the most imperceptible difference between a Canadian from Vancouver and one from Toronto. Like in Toronto, they say the classic "aboot" thing, and that's about it. Every cultural reference and every other aspect of them is just like same as a Canadian from Alberta or BC, but yet we're talking about this enormous stretch of distance, right? And then when I came here, not only are the accents in Ireland alone utterly different in the different areas, and not only that, between parts of Dublin, let's say even almost a different language. The accent is so heavy in different parts of Dublin, but the scenery too. You drive to the next county, let alone to Galway or whatever, and the landscape changes dramatically. And it seems like over a smaller distance, there's packed in this immensely. This is the big difference I noticed between the two. I don't remember what your original question was that led me down this.
No, keep going.
This rant about it, but yeah, that's something I noticed between Europe and Canada. But like Canada's kind of unique in that way, perhaps, because it's obviously the reason is not landscape wise, but in terms of the people. It's a newer country that developed in the more modern time before, this is another thing I noticed and talked about in my art book, is that any kind of true cultural, any kind of true culture or art of any kind, including local, regional dialects, accents, cuisine, traditions of any kind, clothing, whatever, anything that springs up in a local area and becomes beloved of that area, is due to it being historically the limitations of them being isolated and having to use everything around them to survive. So that's something. So Canada being a more modern, recent place, the entire breadth of this enormous landmass is almost entirely, utterly homogenous in that sense, and modern and whatever. And now it's being utterly just kind of replaced with.
And do you see a negative consequence on the arts?
Oh well, obviously I'm a fan of culture, so yeah. I mean that's why I think everything should be. That's why we need to force colloquialism and limitation, or there are certain things that try to do this. Like people who are a fan of food say, go for the slow food, local food movements. Because you notice this is true of all culture and all art. Everything that you enjoy.
How do you do that without it being contrived?
Well, first step would be to recognize what I've just said, which most people don't, and it's almost probably impossible to explain to the average person. But I think it's not impossible if you think then that you must form a localized and eccentrically, like I say, colloquial custom in any kind of art form or anything you want to do, anything at all, which sort of does still happen inevitably. And even in groups, even in say online groups, the way the different groups form online, even though they're physically international, you might say this is something you can say. But in terms of like art and traditions of style, I mean, it's not just that everything's globalist and everything is technological and industrial. A lot of it is shite and crap. In my book, again, I have a chapter on hierarchical industrialization, in which I argue that if industrialization was not so much the tool of the merchant class in just doing nothing but finding faster, cheaper ways to produce household items, or you know what I mean, like in an ever more profit-centered factory system.
Yep.
If technology was more geared towards traditional heroic goals, which frankly you see with the likes of Elon Musk, I think like people criticize him in different ways and hate him for this and that, but at least I am a big fan of his space program stuff, and I can see him he has centered his power on a heroic goal in terms of that. Things like that, I think I have great admiration for. But if I'm just saying, if we had a different view to the world that didn't exploit and use things like free trade, and everything wasn't centered around middleman profits and things like this, then you wouldn't have this Walmartization of culture, at least not nearly as much. And you would at least have some localized culture by necessity. And that should be celebrated and supported and et cetera. And monopolization should be rejected.
Homogenization to some extent is the enemy, I guess. The internet's interesting in that regard because it's an accelerator of homogenization, But because we're not all watching the same 3 or 4 TV channels or listening to the same 2 radio stations, we're all in our own little groups where new colloquialisms, as you said, arise. You both have like you simultaneously have homogenization, more and more people speak English, but also like a greater and greater degree of separation between people into these kind of novo tribes, many of which are just purely based on the internet itself. So it's interesting. It's almost like a kind of neo-tribalism.
It is, yeah, it is.
Yeah, like a project, like a project like yours, a project like mine. Would those things be as feasible in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s? Maybe they were. There were some antecedents, things like in America, Against Me by Jim Goad. You had a number of very interesting magazines. I came across one.
There used to be lots. Yeah, in the 80s, he wasn't the only one. I remember lots in the 80s and the 90s. Like being an old fellow, I can remember someone like Jim Goad was like a dime a dozen. There was so many of those kind of undergroundy,
which are totally cool. But I suppose the issue is that like each one of these things would have maybe 10 or 20, people in terms of its readership.
They would have more. They would have more. They would get out there. I remember magazines like his. You'd find them on college campuses, weirdos and freaks on college campuses everywhere, even Canada. Like, we weren't even in America. You would find they would find a way to get sort of distributed. Even I had a friend who used to go around Xeroxing these things and making his own version and stapling them together.
Nice.
And just handing them out for free. And this is back in art school in British Columbia, but it was really a thing. Yeah, before the internet, people can imagine that you would have to have these. Yeah, such a thing.
Like
there's no websites.
Because my age, it's difficult for me to kind of like get a proper sense of the pre-internet age. But what was I going to say on just on like before we move on to a different topic, just on the question of preserving kind of peculiarities of a culture. Two groups that are very good at this are the Amish and the Mennonites. Now, I'm not saying we should all become Amish and Mennonites. Maybe we should. Maybe we should synthesize that with some sort of variant of Irish nationalism. It'd be kind of funny. But these are groups which, despite being subsumed,
it's very Protestant. It's so Protestant. It's so like the book is the law.
Yeah. But despite being like subsumed in the United States of America, a country which is famed for its cannibalization of ethnic groups when they enter the country, they make them into these kind of standardized mass groupings, which are all at each other's throats. These groups nevertheless survived and actually thrived. The Amish population, from what I know now, doubles every 2 years. So not 2 years, every 10 years or so. Mennonites are set to, I don't know what percentage of the population of Bolivia Mennonites are set to be, but their population growth, you may have seen, is accelerating dramatically. And these are groups which have their own customs, have their own unique aspects, a lot of problematic aspects, I'm sure, too. But is religion something which can conserve these things, because it forces you to be present? If you're a Catholic, you have to go to mass on Sundays. If you're Muslim, you have to go to the mosque at certain times of the week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It takes you away from this internet space, which, as I said, is partly an accelerator of homogenization across the globe.
Well, that's also a very difficult question. There's Mennonites in Canada, and I used to see them around. There was no Amish.
Right.
But like, they're not, how can I put it? From what I can see about them, like, in some ways they're sort of ossified as well. Like in a proper situation, you would have the geographic, or the, how should I say, ethnographic limitations would not just like cause a culture to ossify and remain the same forever, but that it would, it continue to evolve and change, but in its own peculiar way. As evolve from its traditions as it should, instead of like being totally coerced out of them and adopting a whole other globalist tradition. Like the globalist tradition obviously is the worst of them all, because it's not a tradition at all. It's just a way to get them all to combine at their basic material needs or whatever. But so in the case of the Amish, I see it. It's hard to say, because in a longer time frame, let's say they have a good survival strategy genetically, and via their religion, it seems to be more or less working out for them. But I don't know that it's the life that I would want to live personally. And in a certain sense, like I said, they're kind of like trying to hold on to something that can you really is it a good thing overall? And I don't know the answer entirely. I believe change is inevitable, and I believe change is inevitable. And you didn't want to touch. I don't want to get on. We won't touch on religion itself and the issues.
We can touch on it to an extent, I suppose. But yeah, what do you want to say?
Well, just that the internet and knowledge generally will dispel. So if you are generally speaking, and not entirely, because people go back into it, but they have to force themselves back into it and refuse to believe things that they have seen or something. Often not the case with all religions, but with many of them, it's something that the internet kind of does lessen. Or I'm not a person who totally poo-boos the internet as an evil thing all the time either. I do think there's a lot of good things about it. It's bad that it became censored so heavily, but now recently it's not quite as. And overall, I don't know. It's bad in that it warps certain minds into certain things. But then in another sense, it's this weird, interesting global mass mind, brain of the earth thing. In which you can learn. You can still learn, even during the censorship times. You could still have your fingertips a lot of knowledge that is interesting.
Internet archives.
So yeah, if there's some way to sort of move with the times yet be yourself, I mean, I think that's
if you want to strive, hard to reach.
Yeah,
the golden mean.
Yeah. In terms of what it means for, like, say, Irish nationalism, or you're still in a slightly better position than so many other countries like Canada, where
that's what one of the speakers said last week. He said, you look at France, you look at the voters for right-wing parties, it far exceeds Ireland, but there's a sort of reflexive patriotism even among the Irish left, which the French can't match, I suppose.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah, the average Irish person still is actually at the average level, I think, is quite nationalist, or just sort of like, I don't know. They have there's like two tiers in their brain where there's one where they don't really accept, the the new liberal value system at all. They've never accepted it. They sort of just regard it as something they sort of have to put up with. And then there's another where they, can fulfill that programming through their day or their work day or whatever. But I don't know. There's a difference between them and, say, when I talk to my Canadian friends.
Or even
where I feel they're more.
No, continue, sir.
English, yeah. Let me think.
If you look at the English,
I don't know English people other than.
There was a poll that came out, and I think around a minority, I won't put a number on it, identify as English anymore. Most of them will identify as British, right? Now that's significant, because to them, Englishness, and this is something which is very recent, Englishness connotes the BNP. Englishness connotes, skinheads, connotes
oh my god, is that how it is? Really?
Right-wing undesirables. Yeah, it's terrible, and the same doesn't, you don't find the same phenomenon among the Welsh or the Scottish, and I think just on Irish nationality, you may find a huge swath of the population that have no interest in the political expression of sort of Irish nationality, whether that be republicanism or sort of nationalism, although there's a republican aspect to that, nationalism in its true sense. But you'll struggle to find people that hate their country, like somebody that would be embarrassed or would kind of look around before they said anything too patriotic. They might view themselves as above it. Honestly, if you were to examine their conscience, you'd realize, you'd find that these people don't hate their country.
Yeah, no, they don't. They love it and they're proud of it.
Yeah.
But there's also, there's certain class distinctions in that, like. Oh yeah. Like people in America think that the likes of Conor McGregor is a widely loved hero or something, but
that's not the case.
Certain people absolutely despise him.
Driving down a desolate highway, headlights burning red like a demon's eyes. There's a shadow in your rearview mirror. You'll never get off this road alive. From the suicide doors to a drumline pit, here glass packs rock, blowing in the wind. She's a hitchhiker's nightmare.
I do want to talk about Shrek.
Oh, right.
Your thoughts on on the podcast on Shrek as a figure, his views, his kind of place in the culture with things like Radio Werewolf, I presume. You've listened to them before, et cetera, et
Yep.
cetera. I think he's. I'll put it this way, right? When I went into that podcast, a friend of mine had sent it to me. I was very dismissive of Shrek, and then after listening to it, I don't agree with the guy in a lot of things, but I came away with the sense that this is a very well-read individual. This is someone who's thought deeply about these topics, and he's someone that I should not have dismissed at first instance. So I suppose that's a credit to you for getting the best out of him. But yeah, but like,
well, thanks.
What are your reflections on that interview?
Yeah, more or less agree. I was, I mean, he had a really long process before you could interview him of like having to get to know him and phone calls and things, which I've never had to go through before. And he was like, "Oh, we must chat and get to know each other and do this and that." But yeah, I would have these conversations with him, and they were always, and every time actually, it was like the podcast. And he was revealing things to me that was like, oh my God, I need to know more. And like, it was just like fascinating, right? I'd have a question about just about everything he said. He even said things that he did not bring up on the podcast that I could confuse the two now in my brain as to what he said on the stream and what he told me personally. But it was certain things. What was he saying? He told me some stuff about Manson I'd never heard and some other things that were just amazing. And I was like, oh my God. And his talk about religion. But I didn't expect him to be so well, to have like, read Rene Guénon and have certain views that he did.
Yeah.
And he definitely had, he's got some great songs, more recent songs he's done actually that were
I haven't listened to his recent stuff.
Yeah, well, there's, some of it I don't love it or whatever, but there's some great, excellent, like takes on modern lyrics where he's talking about all these culture war stuff that we're talking about, like, and the groups online and what they say and do, like 4chan stuff. And he's got songs about this. That's actually very hilarious. I was loving it. Just his lyrics were very funny and insightful and really good. Yeah. But I would, more or less agree that he was surprisingly like well-read. And I mean, I had a feeling I'd seen him. I remember seeing him on TV when I was young. I remember seeing him on Geraldo and all these, the evil Satanist. And then I just come across one of his videos. I think it was about Richard Ramirez. Randomly, it was recommended on YouTube. And then I got, obviously, just like all YouTube things, I started watching all these other videos about him. And that caused me to approach him and ask him if he would be interviewed. And he was very kind to agree to do that. And it was great. But I noticed listening to those videos that you could talk to him, you could set him off on any topic. Indeed, not just my video. Look up any video where he's being interviewed, and you'll set him off on a topic, and he'll talk for a long time, and he'll say a lot of incredibly interesting things, and the things he will link together, the people he will sort of be in the middle of. It's just amazing. Like these celebrities from. Like from like Sammy Davis Jr. to Steve McQueen and Charlie Manson, Angela Lansbury, Richard Nixon.
You find that with Manson himself. Despite starting his life in very impoverished and, to put it mildly, humble conditions. This is a man that knew everyone from the Beach Boys to he definitely was acquainted with the Roman Polanski circle prior to those murders taking place.
He knew all those people, yeah.
Yeah, like I think from what I know, Shrek's take on, and I should probably add, actually I'll add that in a second, but Shrek's take on the Manson murders is it was a drug deal that went bad. I don't know what his take on the LaBianca murders are. About the Manson murders there a second ago, I was referring specifically to the murder of Sharon Tate, the Polish guy, two other individuals, three if you include Sharon Tate's baby. Which I hope we all do. But yeah, and then the LaBianca murders, I'm not too sure about. Because I'd read a good portion of Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, which Look, O'Neill has this sort of approach whereby he won't
Is he
say
Irish or
X.
is he Irish or American Irish?
He's
Don't mind
he's
me.
he's American, presumably is of Irish extraction. I'm not really sure about his
Okay.
ancestry, but
Right.
O'Neill says in the book, well, okay, so O'Neill won't say it's the CIA behind it, but he'll like lay out all of the documents or what he's telling you are the facts,
Yeah.
and you're there to draw the inference. And
Yeah.
everyone's drawn the inference that it's the CIA, but Shrek has vociferously denounced this. He claims that it was a drug deal gone bad, and that the CIA narrative is absurd. And he interviewed one or two guys who he claims O'Neill, who he had dealt with, I think, 20 years ago, with respect to the Manson case. In retrospect, of course, not at the time, they weren't litigating it in court, but
Yeah.
he had. He said that he had slandered that O'Neill had slandered a few individuals and had been ignoring Shrek. So yeah,
Right.
that's
Well, so
it's
what do
interesting.
you which side, which camp do you fall on? Do you fall on Shrek's side or?
I'm not learned enough to opine on the whole thing. I do think that the drug deal narrative has the backing of from memory of Bobby Beausoleil.
We see Nirvana in a desert land. Beausoleil, thine anger rising like a scorpion. Beausoleil.
Bobby Beausoleil is a very interesting guy. He was insinuated into the 60s counterculture.
Right.
Kenneth Anger made a film called Lucifer Rising. He also
Yeah, I've never seen this. I've always meant to see that. Have you seen that?
Same, yeah. I've never seen it either, but I've listened to part of the soundtrack, and that was done
Oh,
by
it's amazing.
that was done by Bobby Beausoleil.
Oh, right, of course, yeah, right.
So
him, yeah.
Bobby Beausoleil was kind of like, and this is kind of I don't want to get into this too much because it gets into some pretty interesting territory, but I mean that's conducive to a good podcast.
It's too interesting to get into.
Too interesting to get into. Wait for a book to come out, but like this gets into the whole idea of his 60s and thereafter right wing counterculture. What was that, etc. But we can get onto that in a second because the reason I brought that up there is because Bobby Beausoleil was right wing. How right wing I didn't get into it, but yeah, he was a right wing figure. So is
Shrek is obviously kind of Shrek is also that way. Yeah.
So Boyd Rice, who Shrek knew. Michael Moore,
right, of course, yeah.
Lords of Chaos. Again, I'm probably getting too into this now, but anyway, Bobby Beausoleil showed up at a guy's house, tortured him for like 24 hours or whatever. I think Manson showed up, caused some damage to this guy, and Beausoleil's argument is that this is all over a drug deal, and then the Manson murders were to get him off or to distract from the crime that he committed. To make it appear as if the killer was still loose. It wasn't Bobby. So that's the narrative that was put out there by him. So I'm pretty sure Shrek agrees with that narrative. There's a small chance that might not be Beausoleil's narrative. That might be someone else's narrative, which Beausoleil rejects.
From what I heard of anything of the talks he's given, it sounds like there's a woman who involved. The one woman who got off. What's her name?
Is it Kasabian?
Can't remember. Could be Linda Kasabian. Is that it? I think maybe her.
Maybe no. Atkins and Kasabian were the two women that were killers, I believe.
Oh, I don't remember the name. I don't remember her name, anyways. But one of the women that was there and present for the whole thing, who the last I heard in Shrek being interviewed, anyways, he said this is that she sort of instigated it and talked to this guy Tex Watson.
Tex Watson, yeah.
And she really sort of they were there.
They're on speed, weren't they?
No, I don't know if they were on. Yeah, probably they were on speed. But the whole thing, the drug deal was over the early version of MDMA. It was just called MDA back then. Apparently, it came from Canada,
right?
Back then, and whatever, right? And they went there. The people living in Sharon Tate's house owed the money.
Okay.
And so they went in there just to roughhouse them and get the money out of them or whatever. And this woman was high, and she talked Tex into killing them just out of it, and it sort of talked him up and sort of instigated the whole thing, like going crazy and whatever. And she's the only one who got off somehow in some mysterious other twist of events with all the people that were there, and they basically were tied up, and he ended up killing them. And he had been squirrely for a while. He'd really kind of lost his mind on some other drug. He was a drug
enforcer, wasn't? Or he was an enforcer for drug dealers, or I think he would rob drug dealers. He was like. He had pretty good beginnings in Texas, but he became a dark horse way before the killings took place.
So I tend to believe I tend to believe I'm not a very ultimately. I'm conspiratorial about certain things you might say, but generally I go for the easiest, obvious answer. So, not saying out of any preference for Shrek. Before I'd ever interviewed him, I tend to agree the most likely answer is the most sort of shabby and just a drug deal gone bad. Not like fucking what's the thing they love? They love the CIA. What's that program that Ted Kaczynski would put through?
MK Ultra, yeah.
MK Ultra, yeah. They love all that kind
of
that,
that's really part of the boomer truth canon. There was a conspiratorial turn in left-wing thought.
Well, they did it to him. They did it. He was a subject of Manson was. They did do that to him. Yeah. But I don't think it. It's still what it screwed up. Maybe it added to his screwed up head. Well, who knows? But
yeah, I know they definitely did it to Ted Kaczynski, and I'm pretty sure Tom O'Neill would claim they did it to Manson. But I think Shrek would be skeptical of that, but I'm not sure, and I'm not treating him.
I think he agrees that they did something. Okay. They gave him LSD early on or something. Right. But it's like the idea that the CIA plotted out the murder for some other reason, or that it was some satanic thing. I would tend to agree.
Yeah,
it's unlikely. But the funny things that are true are just hilarious, like the fact that Steve McQueen was involved and that he came back later to collect the drugs, but while the bodies were still there. Maybe not, but that's a funny little.
Or the tapes and this is I heard about this by way of O'Neill, who I'm not completely dismissing, by the way. I'm not an authority on the subject, but O'Neill said that there was videos of Roman Polanski's wife Sharon Tate being essentially raped, and that the police did not produce this, or did not sort of collect this as evidence. They put it back, and Bugliosi had committed perjury during the case itself. So there's a number of shady aspects to the whole prosecution.
Well, have you heard the stuff about Shrek told me about the porn tapes that Manson used to make? Because as well as a pimp and a robber, he produced porn and was actually himself involved in gay porn.
I didn't hear that via the podcast, but yeah, I've heard about that somewhere else.
Right, and there's stories about him getting.
We won't get too graphic.
Well, okay. Apparently, supposedly, according to this, he had sex with Peter Falk, like who? Columbo. The
really
guy who plays Columbo, yeah. And also Cary Grant and like some other, because this is Hollywood, right? They're all living in Hollywood.
Tro Mama Cass in there, I suppose.
Whatever, but apparently there's a whole catalog of porn tapes that were an underground thing that Manson produced.
This is how I'm going to advertise this podcast.
But apparently Hugh Hefner owned them when he was alive, and nobody knows where they are. And they were a real thing that were owned, and they were even they were obviously like sort of an Epstein thing where they instigated there was famous people involved in these porn things.
There was a ring around Polanski as well, which was kind of Epstein-esque or Diddy-esque.
Right. Yeah. Right. Obviously, of course there was. But it's all this crazy shit going on. The whole thing is just a universe of just pop culture insanity, which is excellent. Like we've spent the whole second half of this thing talking about it, and we haven't even hardly touched on it.
So we have around 10 minutes left, and I think we might leave it at that after that. So is there any subject you want to talk about for the last 10 minutes, or we could talk about David Lynch if you want, or we could talk about
if you want, yeah. No, sure. What about Lynch? Shrek has no time for Lynch, I should tell you. Not in his art. He likes his art, but because I asked him about because he practices his tantric Buddhism, and I was like,
meditation.
Well, the type, no, but that's different. That's the type that Lynch practiced.
Oh, which is the type. Sorry, apologies. I thought you were talking.
Yes, he does. He does meditate, but it's different apparently than the stuff that Lynch was on about. Shrek insists is a scam, and despite all his great art and everything else, the yogi that was who incidentally Manson was really into as well. Because Manson was a bit of a mystic. Obviously, he was a mystic, and everyone gathered around him because they thought it was a shaman. Beach Boys and all the rest of them. There's a Beach Boys album in which he's playing music on as well. That's another funny thing.
Yeah, but they do a cover of one of his songs as well.
But there's another one. There's a more recent release of their unreleased material, in which it openly has him a bunch of material and him actually playing on it apparently as well, because they were totally the entire Beach Boys were totally into the cult of Manson, and apparently he was having sex with Dennis Wilson there.
Yeah, Wilson was very much beholden to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, what was I going to say about that? What were we talking about? I had a point that I didn't reach.
I think I brought up Lynch, and then you kind of went.
Oh, that's it. Sorry,
said that
Sorry.
Shrek didn't have much time for him, which I found
Well,
interesting.
my whole point was, and Shrek said, that Manson was also a shaman of sorts, but he was a shaman who would also steal your car and stab you in the back or whatever.
Well, on
and he had these two sides.
On shamanism and David Lynch, I was going back to the Iliad recently, and I think therein, I think I was reading this Samuel Butler's translation of the Iliad, which may or may not be a good, but whatever, that's neither here nor there. Butler himself's a rather interesting kind of character. Butler was a bit of a kind of rebel against Victorian mores, etc., etc., etc. But in his translation, I believe the exact quote is, "Dreams are of Jove, or dreams are the provenance of Jove." And in that sense, in given these dreams is one of the central motifs of most of Lynch's work, probably apart from the Straight Story, which I haven't seen yet, but it doesn't strike me that it intersects with dreams all that much. Maybe I'm wrong, but insofar as he was someone that had that as a motif in his art, you could argue there was a shamanistic aspect to it or a religious aspect.
Well, yeah, it worked for him, obviously, despite Shrek saying this is nonsense and a scam. Maybe, but that's, you might just say that's from any basic meditation. But apparently, the specific guy in this specific practice was like a invented thing for Americans, kind of thing, is what he says. Right. And the people who really followed it were not practicing proper Buddhist meditation or something. I don't know. This is what he told me.
He's quite orthodox, isn't he? Or at least he's quite, no, I shouldn't say zealous, but he takes it very seriously. Whereas most Western Buddhism,
I have no idea.
Whereas Buddhism, from what I've heard, yeah, but most Buddhists, Western Buddhists, tend to be rather, they're not really religious. A lot of them are atheists. From what I know, Shrek is not an atheist. That's one key difference.
Right.
So yeah, there's an actual metaphysical dimension to his beliefs.
And I do believe in Lynch's form of, I've always meant to do it. I haven't really.
Oh, I was referring to Shrek's form. I don't know about Lynch's.
No, I know you were, but I'm trying to steer it back to Lynch. I'm trying to leave Shrek alone. But I did try to do it, and I don't know. I feel like for what I need to do, I'm a fairly naturally creative person. I've never feel at a loss for ideas for what I like to do and what I try to do. And for whatever reason, that's whatever way I'm wired, it springs to my mind. I don't feel maybe I would be that much better if I meditated or I don't know, but I don't feel the need for it. Lynch was kind of very strange. I think he was actually really quite an extreme autist. If you look at videos of him and that,
oh yeah,
very particular about having things a certain way, and certain things would make him very cranky, and he'd be like, a lot of his even his meditation stuff was based around avoiding feeling negative and just sort of being like extremely angry about certain things. I don't know.
I suppose from the perspective, there's a guy I take a lot of stock in, Philip Reef. He was a kind of right wing Freudian, as weird as that sounds.
Right.
He was actually married to a young Susan Sontag, and there's kind of a funny story there, but I won't get into it because we only have around 4 or 5 minutes left. But from Sontag as someone that would view the New Age as symptomatic of the decline of institutions in Western society, and a central kind of myth that guides Western orders.
And we're talking about the extreme feminist that was.
Yeah, he was married to her. He was married to her, but he wasn't an extreme feminist. He was kind of a right winger. He was an interesting guy.
Okay.
Right, okay. But Reef would condemn all. Well, not, I don't know about Shrek's beliefs, but certainly condemn the kind of New Age views of a David Lynch, for instance, as overly subjective, as an expression of one's fickleness. Whereas religion for him should be something which is about ordinances, submission to a central command, being bound.
So Islam basically.
Well, I don't know if he was to Islam, given this guy was.
What was his faith? What was his faith? Was he Catholic or what was?
I think he was an atheist, but he believed this should be the case. He's a sociologist,
for God's sake.
For thee, not for me.
Well, I mean, you can achieve all that
in the tradition of Auguste Comte. But yeah,
I think everything is cults, right? Everything springs from cults. Everything is a cult, and even when you say this and that, even our online groups, even though they're either political or cultural in nature, even say what you're doing with. What's the name of it again?
Meon.
It's very hard to remember. Wait, is that an Irish word? Because it's very hard to. I have trouble remembering this word.
Yeah.
But not to say you're starting a cult specifically. Although do do have a section on my website that I want to make a sort of login that I will create into a cultish environment. But everything springs from that. All these things spring from something like that. It's nothing to be ashamed of in a way, unless it's an evil cult like Manson's.
Yeah.
Or, a criminal, it's just because I would disagree with that guy. Wasn't he Reed? Is that what he said?
Philip Reed.
Reef. In that, I do think that as fruity as the New Agers can be, if there is an intellectualism of religion, it is quite syncretic, especially in the modern age, and we have all the information about history and the different religions. Yet there is not only a need for religion, there is a very real possibility of God, and in the sense of a prime motivation of the universe. The fact that it's here, that we're doing something, that nothing is, it's not that nothing is happening. Some kind of machine of energy has been set in motion for some reason, whatever, I'm sure it's quite beyond human understanding. But I do ascribe to certain New Agey, it's through Platonism. I consider myself a Platonist, but I do think there's...
Well, I think that has a bit of metaphysical rigor, which, like, say, Theosophy would lack, or maybe Ariosophy. Or some other kind of more woo kind of belief. Like Platonism is quite a serious tradition. Yeah,
I do think it's injected a lot into Christianity, and it is the philosophy of religion in so many ways.
All across the empire dead, the pulse of life cuts through the